The banking software could steal $47 million in under 90 seconds. Marcus Thompson knew this because he'd just found the hidden code that made it possible. 20 colleagues watched as security dragged him out for exposing it. The woman in the corner? She asked one question that morning, a question that proved she already knew what Marcus had discovered. 2 days later, an anonymous email mentioned James Rodriguez, a name that made Marcus's blood run cold. His wife had whispered that name the night before she died. The same woman who watched his humiliation was now offering him a job that paid 3 times his old salary. But here's what nobody saw coming. She didn't just know about the stolen money. She knew exactly who killed Marcus's wife and why. Marcus Thompson's Tuesday morning started like any other, except for the knot in his stomach that had been growing for 3 weeks. At 39, he'd learned to trust his instincts, especially when they screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with the banking software he'd been debugging. The coffee in the Tech Nova break room tasted like burnt disappointment, bitter and over-extracted from sitting too long on the burner. Marcus barely noticed the familiar morning chaos of his Silicon Valley workplace, developers arguing over code reviews, product managers scheduling conflicting meetings, and the persistent hum of servers processing millions of financial transactions. His mind was racing through lines of code, trying to make sense of what he'd discovered the night before, while his 10-year-old son Jake slept peacefully in the next room. A hidden back door, buried so deep in the system architecture that finding it required either incredible luck or inside knowledge, capable of draining accounts faster than most people could blink. He'd printed out the evidence at 2 a.m, his hands shaking as page after page of damning code emerged from his home printer. The timestamps told a story of deliberate sabotage, with modifications made during maintenance windows when security monitoring was at its lowest. Marcus had triple-checked his findings, running the code through multiple analysis tools to ensure he wasn't seeing patterns where none existed. But every test confirmed his worst fears. Someone had intentionally created a pathway for massive financial theft, hidden within legitimate banking software that processed retirement funds, college savings, and small business loans. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders as he realized that millions of families could lose everything if this vulnerability was exploited. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that doing the right thing was never easy, but always necessary. The conference room at Tech Nova buzzed with the usual corporate energy as 20 employees filed in for the quarterly security review. Marcus clutched his folder of printouts, rehearsing his presentation in his head while trying to ignore the anxiety that made his palms sweat. He'd worked at this prestigious Silicon Valley company for 4 years, always feeling like the outsider without the Stanford degree that seemed to be a prerequisite for respect among his colleagues. His self-taught programming skills had earned him a place at the table, but never quite the recognition he craved. Today felt different, though. Today, his unconventional background and obsessive attention to detail had uncovered something that could save millions of people from financial ruin. CEO David Chen sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses that reflected the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. The man had built Tech Nova from a garage startup into a billion-dollar corporation. But Marcus had always sensed something calculating behind his public persona. Marcus noticed a woman he didn't recognize sitting in the corner, her laptop open, fingers dancing across the keyboard with the practiced precision of someone who lived and breathed technology. She wore a charcoal business suit that suggested authority, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes. When CEO Chen introduced her, she looked up for the first time, and Marcus felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, though he was certain they'd never met. "I'm Elena Williams," she said, her voice carrying an authority that made Marcus pause mid-sentence in his mental rehearsal. "Cybersecurity consultant from Mitchell & Associates. Please, continue with your presentation." Something about her presence felt calculated, as if she'd been waiting for this exact moment, studying the room's dynamics with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey. Marcus shook off the feeling and launched into his presentation, explaining how the hidden code could transfer massive amounts of money to offshore accounts within seconds, leaving victims unaware until their accounts were already empty. Elena asked only one question during his entire 20-minute presentation, but it was a question that changed everything. The timestamp on line 4712 of the core banking module, she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. When was that specific line of code last modified, and who had access to make changes during that maintenance window? Marcus felt the color drain from his face as the implications hit him. That specific line was buried so deep in the system that finding it required either incredible luck or intimate knowledge of the software's architecture. He'd spent hours tracing the code paths to discover it, yet Elena had identified its exact location from his brief overview. He stammered through an answer about metadata logs and change management protocols, but Elena's knowing smile told him she'd already heard enough. The room fell silent except for the soft whir of the air conditioning, and Marcus realized that everyone was staring at him with expressions that had shifted from curiosity to suspicion. David Chen's voice, when it came, was ice-cold and measured. "Marcus, we've discovered that you've been accessing systems outside your clearance level, violating multiple security protocols in the process." The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. He tried to explain that he'd found the back door while doing routine maintenance, following standard debugging procedures that had been approved by his supervisor months earlier. But Chen cut him off with a raised hand, his expression suggesting that explanations were unwelcome. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." The words echoed in Marcus's ears as two uniformed security guards stepped forward, their faces professionally blank, but their presence unmistakably threatening. 20 pairs of eyes watched as he was forced to pack his desk into a cardboard box, years of personal items and work achievements reduced to a pathetic collection of coffee-stained notebooks and family photos. His printed evidence was confiscated as company property, leaving him with nothing to prove what he'd discovered. Elena Williams remained seated throughout the humiliating process, her expression unreadable as Marcus was marched through the open office space toward the exit. Colleagues he'd worked with for years avoided eye contact, suddenly finding their computer screens fascinating. The walk to the elevator felt endless, each step echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over the normally bustling workspace. Marcus caught Elena's eye one final time as the elevator doors began to close, and something in her gaze suggested this wasn't the last he'd see of her. Standing in the parking lot with his pathetic box of personal items, Marcus felt the weight of single parenthood crash down on him like a physical force. Jake was counting on him for everything: rent, food, health insurance, college savings, and now he was unemployed in the most expensive job market in America. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd been fired for trying to protect people from exactly the kind of financial devastation he now faced. The memory of his wife Sarah's final words haunted him as he drove home through Silicon Valley traffic. "Promise me you'll find the truth about James Rodriguez." He'd never understood what she meant, dismissing it as the confused rambling of someone weakened by aggressive cancer treatments. But hearing that name in Elena's email 2 days later made his skin crawl with recognition and dread. The anonymous message had been brief and cryptic. "We need to talk about what you know regarding James Rodriguez. Your firing wasn't random. Meet me at the address below if you want answers." Marcus stared at his phone screen in his empty apartment, wondering if accepting this meeting would be the smartest or stupidest decision of his life. Jake was at school, unaware that their world had just collapsed around them. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, a sound that reminded Marcus of all the bills that would soon go unpaid if he couldn't find another job quickly. The address Elena provided led to a modest office building in downtown San Jose, far from Silicon Valley's gleaming towers and venture capital showcases. Cyber Shield Solutions occupied the 3rd floor, its reception area decorated with cutting-edge security awards and photos of smiling employees working on laptops in trendy coffee shops. Marcus had researched the company obsessively for 2 days, finding surprisingly little concrete information for a cybersecurity firm that claimed to serve Fortune 500 clients. Their website was professionally designed but vague on specifics, listing services like advanced threat detection and corporate security consulting without providing case studies or client testimonials. The receptionist, a cheerful woman in her 20s with purple streaks in her hair, seemed genuinely surprised when Marcus mentioned he had an appointment with a technical lead. She made several phone calls before directing him to a conference room where Elena Williams sat reviewing files, looking nothing like the corporate consultant who'd witnessed his humiliation just 48 hours earlier. Elena's transformation was startling and somehow unsettling. Gone was the severe bun and conservative business suit, replaced by dark jeans and a simple black sweater that made her appear younger and more approachable. Her hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, softening features that had seemed sharp and calculating in Technova's conference room. "I owe you an explanation," she said without preamble, gesturing for Marcus to sit across from her at a small table scattered with technical manuals and empty coffee cups. And probably several apologies. The conference room felt intimate, compared to Technova's sterile corporate environment, with whiteboards covered in complex network diagrams and shelves lined with vintage computer equipment that suggested someone with deep respect for technological history. Marcus noticed that several of the diagrams looked like banking system architectures, but far more sophisticated than anything he'd seen at his previous job. Elena's eyes held a vulnerability that hadn't been present during his firing, as if she'd dropped a carefully maintained professional mask to reveal something more authentic underneath. The job offer that followed defied all logic and previous experience. Elena explained that CyberShield needed someone with Marcus's specific skill set, someone who could spot anomalies and inconsistencies that traditional security analysts missed. The salary she quoted was triple what he'd made at Technova, with benefits that included health insurance, educational support for Jake, and equity participation that could make them wealthy if the company succeeded. But Marcus had learned through painful experience to be suspicious of opportunities that seemed too good to be true. "Why me?" he asked, studying Elena's face for tells and inconsistencies. "Because you found something in 6 hours that took our best analysts 6 months to discover," she replied, her voice carrying conviction that seemed genuine. "And because you tried to do the right thing, even when it cost you everything you'd worked for." Her answer felt honest but incomplete, and Marcus sensed there were layers of truth she wasn't ready to share. Elena handed him a key card and an address in Palo Alto, along with specific instructions to arrive the following evening at exactly 7 p.m. "There's something you need to see before you make your final decision about joining us," she said, her tone suggesting that this mysterious something would fundamentally change his understanding of the situation. The address turned out to be a small craftsman house, tucked behind a row of tech startups, its yard overgrown with native California plants that had been allowed to grow wild. Marcus almost turned around twice, convinced he'd misunderstood Elena's instructions or walked into some elaborate joke at his expense, but the key card worked perfectly, and he found himself standing in what appeared to be a high-tech workshop that had been retrofitted into a 1950s bungalow. Vintage computers from every era of personal computing history lined custom-built workbenches alongside state-of-the-art servers, creating a technological timeline that spoke to someone with deep respect for the evolution of digital innovation. Elena emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression that suggested she was as nervous as Marcus felt about this unconventional meeting. "This was my father's workshop," she said, running her hand along the surface of an original Apple II computer with obvious affection. "He taught me that technology should serve people and protect them, not exploit their vulnerabilities for profit." The workshop felt like a shrine to ethical hacking and responsible innovation, with walls covered in photos of cybersecurity pioneers and handwritten notes about protecting digital privacy and financial security. Marcus found himself relaxing for the first time in weeks, surrounded by evidence of someone who understood that code could be poetry or poison, depending on the programmer's intentions and moral compass. Elena's vulnerability in this sacred space was palpable, as if she'd invited him into the most private corner of her world to show him what really mattered to her. They worked side by side for 3 hours, Elena testing Marcus's skills on increasingly complex security puzzles while sharing stories about her father's influence on her career and worldview. Marcus found himself laughing for the first time since his firing, impressed by Elena's intuitive understanding of systems architecture and her ability to explain complex concepts with elegant simplicity that made difficult problems seem manageable. When she mentioned that she'd been looking for someone with his specific combination of technical skills and moral integrity for over a year, Marcus felt a flutter of something that might have been hope, mixed with professional pride. But it was the way she spoke about her father in past tense, with a grief that mirrored his own loss of Sarah, that made him realize Elena understood the weight of single parenthood and the constant fear of failing the people who depended on you for everything. The evening ended with Elena giving Marcus a sophisticated robot programming kit for Jake, explaining that her father had always believed children should understand technology before it had the chance to shape them in ways they couldn't control. The kit was clearly expensive and educational, designed to teach programming concepts through hands-on building and experimentation. Marcus drove home with more questions than answers, but for the first time in months, he felt like he might be walking toward something meaningful, rather than running from one disaster toward another. Jake's excitement over the robot kit was infectious and genuine, and Marcus found himself thinking that maybe Elena Williams represented a legitimate second chance rather than another disappointment waiting to happen. But as he helped his son build the robot's basic framework late into the night, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Elena was holding back something significant about her true intentions and the real nature of her interest in him. Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into his new role at CyberShield with an enthusiasm that surprised him and seemed to impress his colleagues. The company's projects were fascinating and varied, ranging from protecting small nonprofits from ransomware attacks to consulting on security protocols for medical device manufacturers who needed to protect patient data. Elena proved to be an exceptional mentor and supervisor, pushing Marcus to think beyond purely technical solutions and consider the human impact of every system they secured or vulnerability they discovered. Her approach to cybersecurity was holistic and deeply ethical, always asking not just whether something could be done, but whether it should be done, and who might be harmed by their actions. But it was during their frequent late-night debugging sessions that Marcus began to notice subtle inconsistencies in Elena's background story and casual references that didn't quite add up. Elena's knowledge of legacy banking systems was suspiciously specific and detailed, suggesting hands-on experience that went far beyond what a typical cybersecurity consultant would possess. She occasionally referenced security protocols and system vulnerabilities that hadn't been publicly documented, speaking with the authority of someone who'd been intimately involved in their development or exploitation. When Marcus asked about her previous experience with financial institutions, Elena's answers were carefully vague, mentioning consulting work and research projects, without providing the specific details that usually accompanied legitimate professional experience. Her office was filled with awards and certifications from prestigious security organizations, but the dates on some of them suggested she'd achieved senior-level recognition at an unusually young age. Marcus found himself wondering if Elena Williams was really who she claimed to be, or if her identity was as carefully constructed as the cybersecurity systems she helped design. Marcus's growing suspicions crystallized when he accidentally accessed a server directory that contained detailed files about major corporations he recognized from financial news headlines and business magazines. The files weren't simple consulting reports, but comprehensive intelligence dossiers that included internal communications, financial records, and security assessments that would have required either extensive insider access or sophisticated hacking capabilities to obtain. Elena caught him browsing the files within minutes, appearing at his workstation with an expression that shifted rapidly from surprise to something that looked uncomfortably like fear. "Those are from our consulting contracts," she explained quickly, but Marcus had seen enough to know that CyberShield's client list was far more extensive and influential than any small startup should reasonably possess. The companies in those files represented hundreds of billions of dollars in market capitalization. Yet Elena's firm operated out of a modest office space, with fewer than a dozen visible employees. The mathematics of the situation simply didn't add up, and Marcus began to wonder if his new job was another carefully orchestrated trap rather than the legitimate opportunity it appeared to be. When he discreetly researched CyberShield's corporate structure, he discovered a complex web of holding companies and investment funds that obscured the true source of its funding and ownership. Elena's personal background was similarly opaque, with professional references that checked out, but personal details that seemed carefully scrubbed of anything too specific or verifiable. Marcus found himself caught between gratitude for the job that had saved his family from financial ruin and growing anxiety about the true nature of the organization he'd joined. His instincts, which had served him well throughout his career, were sending increasingly urgent warnings that something fundamental about his situation wasn't what it seemed. The breaking point came when Marcus discovered that Elena had been monitoring his work and personal activities far more closely than any normal supervisor would consider appropriate or legal. Hidden within the company's internal systems, he found comprehensive logs showing that every file he accessed, every line of code he wrote, every website he visited, and even his personal email and text messages were being tracked, analyzed, and stored in databases that seemed designed for intelligence gathering rather than employee management. The sophistication of the surveillance system suggested resources and capabilities that went far beyond what a small cybersecurity firm would need for legitimate business purposes. Confronting Elena in her office the next morning, Marcus demanded an explanation for the intrusive monitoring and the deception he'd uncovered. Her response was careful and measured, but Marcus could see the calculation behind her eyes as she weighed how much truth to reveal without completely destroying the fragile trust they'd built. "We have to be extremely careful about security," Elena said finally, her voice carrying a weight that suggested she was choosing her words with exceptional care. "The people who destroyed your career at Technova are still actively pursuing their agenda, and they're far more dangerous and well-connected than you realize." Her revelation that his firing had been orchestrated by forces beyond David Chen sent Marcus reeling, forcing him to reconsider everything he thought he understood about his situation. According to Elena's research, Technova was just one node in a vast network of companies involved in systematic financial fraud, and Marcus's discovery of the backdoor had threatened to expose an operation that spanned multiple corporations and potentially billions of dollars in stolen funds. "Your wife knew about this conspiracy," Elena said quietly, and Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him as implications he'd never considered began to take shape in his mind. Sarah had been a freelance financial analyst, not someone who would have been involved in corporate espionage or high-stakes financial investigations. But Elena's files contained evidence that Sarah had been methodically investigating irregularities in banking software and financial transaction systems for months before her death, possibly working for someone who wanted to expose the massive fraud she'd uncovered. The timeline was chilling. Sarah's cancer diagnosis had come just weeks after she'd begun asking questions about suspicious financial transactions, and her condition had deteriorated with unusual speed, despite aggressive treatment from some of the best oncologists in the Bay Area. Marcus stared at medical records and communication logs that painted a picture of his wife as a dedicated whistleblower who'd died protecting evidence that could save millions of innocent people from financial devastation. The name James Rodriguez finally made terrible sense when Elena showed Marcus a photograph of her father, a distinguished man in his 60s with eyes that matched Elena's and an expression that suggested both intelligence and profound sadness. James Rodriguez had been a renowned cybersecurity expert and whistleblower who'd spent years documenting corruption and fraud in the technology industry before his death in a car accident that Elena believed was actually murder disguised as mechanical failure. According to Elena's investigation, Sarah had been one of James's most valuable contacts, feeding him information about suspicious financial transactions and software vulnerabilities she'd discovered during her consulting work with various banks and financial institutions. Marcus stared at the photograph, remembering Sarah's whispered words about finding the truth about James Rodriguez, finally understanding that his wife had been trying to protect him from something that had eventually killed her anyway. Elena's true identity hit Marcus like an emotional tsunami, reshaping everything he thought he knew about his situation and the people involved in it. She wasn't just a cybersecurity consultant looking to hire talented programmers. She was the daughter of a murdered whistleblower and the secret owner of multiple companies and organizations working to expose corporate fraud and protect potential victims. Cyber Shield was her primary base of operations, funded by inheritance money and investment returns that she'd used to build an extensive network of investigators, hackers, and security experts dedicated to continuing her father's work and bringing his killers to justice. Marcus realized that his hiring hadn't been about his technical skills, impressive though they might be, but about his connection to Sarah and the evidence she'd died protecting. Elena needed him because he was the key to accessing information that her father and his wife had hidden in systems that only someone with Marcus's specific knowledge and security clearance could unlock. The confrontation in Elena's workshop that evening was inevitable and emotionally devastating for both of them. Marcus accused her of manipulating him, of using his grief and financial desperation to further her own agenda of revenge against the people who'd killed her father. Elena didn't deny the charges, but her counter-argument cut deep into Marcus's sense of moral responsibility. Your wife died because she was trying to protect people like Jake from having their futures stolen by corporate greed and systemic fraud. I'm offering you the chance to finish what she started and make sure her sacrifice wasn't meaningless. The workshop suddenly felt claustrophobic, filled with the ghosts of Elena's father and Marcus's wife, two people who died trying to expose a truth that continued to claim victims while the perpetrators remained free and profitable. Marcus found himself torn between justified anger at being deceived and grudging admiration for Elena's dedication to justice and her willingness to risk everything to protect innocent people. But Elena's next revelation shattered Marcus's world completely and forced him to confront the possibility that everything he thought he knew about his wife's death was a carefully constructed lie. Sarah's death from cancer hadn't been the result of natural causes or random biological tragedy. It had been deliberately induced through slow poisoning, designed to mimic the symptoms of aggressive terminal illness while avoiding detection by standard medical examination. The medical records Elena showed him contained evidence of rare toxins and chemical compounds that cause cellular damage identical to fast-moving cancer, administered over months through seemingly innocent means to avoid arousing suspicion. Marcus stared at his wife's medical files with new eyes, remembering how quickly her condition had deteriorated and how confused her doctors had seemed by the unusual progression of her illness. Elena's voice was gentle but unwavering as she explained that Sarah had known she was dying and had spent her final weeks hiding evidence in computer systems and encrypted files that only Marcus would know how to access and decode. David Chen's sudden appearance at Marcus's apartment building the next evening proved that Elena's warnings about ongoing danger were not paranoid delusions but accurate assessments of a very real threat. Marcus watched from his bedroom window as his former boss spoke with building security, clearly trying to gain access to the residential areas using some combination of authority and deception. Jake was at school, participating in an after-school robotics program that Elena had quietly arranged and funded, but Marcus realized that his son's safety depended entirely on staying ahead of people who'd already demonstrated their willingness to kill innocent people to protect their secrets. When Elena called to warn him that Chen was likely coming for the evidence Sarah had hidden, Marcus made a decision that terrified him but felt inevitable. He would trust Elena completely and commit himself to exposing the conspiracy, because the alternative was letting his wife's murderers win and potentially putting Jake in mortal danger. The chase that followed felt like something from a Hollywood thriller, with Marcus and Elena moving between safe houses and secure locations while trying to decode the digital breadcrumbs Sarah had left behind. Elena's resources were impressive and somewhat frightening, including a network of safe apartments, encrypted communication systems, and vehicles registered to shell companies that suggested years of careful preparation for exactly this scenario. But it was during their second night on the run, huddled in an anonymous motel room while running decryption algorithms on Sarah's hidden files, that Marcus began to see Elena as more than just his dead wife's contact or his mysterious employer with a hidden agenda. She sang softly to herself while working late into the night, unconscious melodies that revealed someone who found comfort in music during stressful situations. She'd somehow procured Jake's favorite breakfast cereal and comic books for their temporary hideout, small gestures that revealed someone who cared about more than just completing her father's mission of revenge and justice. Marcus's hands shook as he finally accessed the encrypted files Sarah had hidden in a secure server farm outside Sacramento. Using passwords and security protocols that combined their wedding anniversary, Jake's birthday, and obscure references to their first date that no one else could have guessed. The evidence was overwhelming and devastating. Bank routing codes, transaction logs, internal communications, and documentation that proved a conspiracy involving dozens of major corporations, government officials, and regulatory agencies. Sarah had died protecting definitive proof that billions of dollars were being systematically siphoned from retirement accounts, college funds, small business loans, and individual savings through sophisticated software backdoors and accounting manipulations. Elena sat beside him as they read through file after file of evidence, her presence both comforting and electric with shared purpose. Marcus realized that somewhere between running for their lives and uncovering his wife's final gift to the world, he'd begun to fall in love with Elena Williams in a way that felt both natural and terrifying. But their moment of triumph was devastatingly short-lived. David Chen's people had somehow tracked them to the server farm, and Marcus watched through security cameras as armed men in tactical gear surrounded the building with military precision. Elena's calm professionalism in the face of immediate physical danger impressed him, but it was her absolute insistence on getting Marcus and Jake to safety before protecting the evidence that made him understand the depth of her commitment to the people she cared about. The escape plan she'd prepared involved splitting up temporarily, with Marcus taking Jake to a secure cabin in the mountains, while Elena stayed behind to upload Sarah's files to every major news outlet, regulatory agency, and law enforcement organization simultaneously, ensuring that the evidence would be impossible to suppress or destroy. Marcus's car accident happened because he was driving too fast on unfamiliar mountain roads, desperate to reach Jake's school before Chen's people realized where he was going and potentially used his son as leverage. The last thing he remembered before his truck skidded on wet pavement and slammed into a massive pine tree was Elena's voice on his phone, telling him that she'd successfully uploaded everything and that Sarah's evidence was finally safe from destruction. When he woke up in the hospital 3 days later with a concussion and several broken ribs, Jake was asleep in the chair beside his bed, and Elena was speaking quietly with his doctor in the hallway about his prognosis and recovery timeline. The relief on her face when she saw him awake was so profound and genuine that Marcus knew his growing feelings for her were reciprocated, even though neither of them had found the words or the right moment to acknowledge what was developing between them. Elena's confession came while Marcus was still groggy from pain medication, making her words feel like a vivid dream he might not remember accurately when he was fully conscious. She told him that she'd been investigating his background and monitoring his activities for months before orchestrating their first meeting, that she'd known about his exceptional skills and his connection to Sarah long before his firing from Technova. The elaborate plan to get him hired at CyberShield had been designed to gain his trust and access to the evidence Sarah had hidden. But Elena admitted that falling in love with him hadn't been part of her carefully calculated strategy. Somewhere between recruiting him for her mission and watching him risk everything to protect Jake, she'd begun to hope that they might build a genuine life together after the conspiracy was finally exposed and the people responsible were brought to justice. The media explosion that followed Sarah's evidence release exceeded even Elena's most optimistic expectations. Federal investigators conducted simultaneous raids on Technova and 17 other companies, arresting executives and freezing accounts containing over $2 billion in stolen funds that were in the process of being transferred to offshore accounts. David Chen was found dead in his office the next morning, apparently by suicide according to the initial police report, though Elena suspected he'd been eliminated by co-conspirators who didn't want him talking to federal prosecutors about the full scope of the conspiracy. Marcus watched the news coverage from his hospital bed, finally understanding the true scope of what his wife had died trying to expose, and feeling a profound sense of pride that her sacrifice had prevented countless other families from losing their life savings to corporate greed and systematic fraud. But the real victory was smaller, more personal, and infinitely more meaningful than the headlines and prosecutions that followed. Jake had drawn a picture while waiting for Marcus to wake up from his medically induced coma, showing 3 people standing in front of a house, with a carefully detailed garden and a dog that looked suspiciously like the golden retriever Jake had been requesting for years. When Marcus asked who the people in the drawing were, Jake explained, matter-of-factly, that it was their new family. You, me, and Elena. Because she takes care of us now and she makes you smile the way Mom used to. Elena's tears when she saw the drawing made Marcus realize that she'd found something in their makeshift family that her wealth and professional success had never provided. A place where she belonged not because of what she could accomplish or contribute, but simply because of who she was as a person. The wedding 8 months later was small and perfect, held in the garden behind Elena's father's workshop, with Jake serving as both ring-bearer and best man simultaneously. Marcus had worried initially that marrying into Elena's considerable wealth would make him feel like he was somehow betraying Sarah's memory or taking advantage of tragic circumstances. But Elena's thoughtful insistence on keeping Sarah's photos prominently displayed in their home, and including Sarah's favorite white roses in the wedding bouquet, showed him that love could honor the past while embracing the future. When Elena whispered her vows about protecting the people she loved and continuing to fight for justice together as partners in every sense of the word, Marcus knew with absolute certainty that Sarah would have approved of the remarkable woman who'd finished the work that had cost her life. CyberShield evolved into something neither Marcus nor Elena had originally envisioned: a non-profit organization dedicated to protecting whistleblowers, exposing corporate fraud, and providing cybersecurity services to vulnerable populations who couldn't afford commercial protection. Marcus took over day-to-day operations, while Elena focused on funding, legal strategy, and building relationships with regulatory agencies and law enforcement organizations. Jake, now 11 and increasingly fascinated by computer programming and ethical hacking, often spent afternoons in the workshop Elena had converted into a learning laboratory for children interested in using technology to protect people rather than exploit them. The sophisticated robot Elena had given him during their first meeting sat on a shelf above his desk, a tangible reminder that sometimes the best gifts come from people who understand what you need before you know you need it yourself. On quiet Sunday mornings, Marcus would wake early and watch Elena and Jake working together on coding projects, their heads bent over laptops in concentrated collaboration that reminded him of his own relationship with Sarah. Elena would explain complex programming concepts with the same patience and enthusiasm her father had shown her, while Jake asked probing questions that revealed a mind that might someday carry on the family tradition of using technology to protect ordinary people from those who would exploit their vulnerabilities. In these peaceful moments, Marcus felt Sarah's presence most strongly, as if his first wife was watching over the family that had grown from the seeds of her sacrifice, and approved of the love that had bloomed in the wake of tragedy. The evidence Sarah died protecting continued to bear fruit years after her death, leading to new investigations, reformed regulations, and strengthened protections that made the financial system measurably safer for ordinary people trying to build secure futures for their families. Marcus kept Sarah's photo on his desk at CyberShield, positioned next to more recent pictures of Jake's school plays, family vacations with Elena, and candid moments that captured the quiet happiness they'd built together. Visitors sometimes asked about the woman in the older photograph, and Marcus would explain that she was the whistleblower who'd made their work possible, a hero who'd given everything to protect strangers she'd never meet, from financial predators who saw ordinary people as nothing more than sources of profit to be exploited. Sometimes the people who seem to destroy your life are actually the only ones who can save it, but more often, Marcus had learned, the people who truly save your life are the ones who help you understand that destruction was never the end of your story, just the painful but necessary beginning of a better, more meaningful chapter that you never could have written on your own.